First story, The Tunnel of Silence. It was a dark and quiet evening when Thomas, a man who had always been drawn to the unknown, found the tunnel. He stumbled upon it while walking through the forest near his home. It wasn't a typical tunnel, hidden under the earth or buried within a cave. Instead, it seemed to grow from the very trees, an archway formed by branches that bent and twisted in unnatural ways, as though inviting him in. The air was thick with an unsettling chill as he stood before it, unsure of whether to step through. But curiosity, as always, got the better of him. Thomas walked into the tunnel, the ground beneath him soft and almost rubbery. As he passed deeper into its shadows, the world he knew seemed to disappear. The forest sounds grew distant, fading into an eerie silence. By the time he reached the end of the tunnel, Thomas felt as though he had crossed into another world entirely. On the other side, the landscape stretched out in front of him, a vast cityscape, silent and still. But this was not his time. This was not the world he had known. The buildings were familiar, yet eerily outdated, abandoned, and decayed, as though time had forgotten them. There were no people, no animals, not even a sound, just the whisper of the wind through empty streets. Thomas wandered for hours, then days, through the desolate city. The buildings towered over him, yet their windows were dark, their doors locked and untouched. He tried to call out, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. He tried to find someone, anyone, but there was no one. Only his footsteps echoed through the empty streets, a constant reminder of his isolation. His desperation grew, and with each passing day, he wondered more about how and why he had come to this place. What had happened to the people? Why was he the only one here? And more importantly, how could he return to his own time, to his own world? As days turned into weeks, Thomas scoured the city for answers. He explored the crumbling buildings, finding libraries filled with dusty books and old machines that no longer functioned. It seemed as though the world had moved on, leaving nothing but the remnants of what once was. But as he explored, he began to notice strange symbols etched into the walls, runes perhaps, or ancient markings that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. One day, while searching through an abandoned office building, Thomas stumbled upon a strange object buried beneath the rubble. It was a small device, unlike anything he had seen before. It hummed faintly, and when he touched it, the symbols on the walls flickered to life, revealing a hidden message. The message was simple, yet chilling. You were meant to find this place. You are the key to preventing the end. Confused and frightened, Thomas continued his search, determined to uncover the truth. The more he delved into the mystery of the tunnel, the more he began to realize that his presence here was no accident. The future he had found was a warning, a vision of what would happen if the timeline was left unchecked. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of wandering and searching, Thomas discovered an ancient underground chamber hidden beneath the city. Inside, a massive machine stood, its purpose unclear. But as he approached, he understood. The machine was the source of the tunnel, the key to his passage through time. And it was malfunctioning, its gears grinding in an endless loop, causing the world around him to slowly deteriorate. Thomas realized what he had to do. He wasn't just a traveler in time, he was the one who could fix it. He had been sent here, not by chance, but by design. He was the one who could prevent the future from becoming a reality. With a heavy heart, Thomas began to work on the machine, trying to reverse the damage that had been done. It was a long and exhausting task, but he knew it was the only way to restore balance to the timeline. As he worked, the city around him seemed to shift and change, slowly coming back to life. The silence that had once filled the streets began to fade, replaced by the distant sounds of life returning. When the machine finally hummed to life, Thomas felt a sudden surge of energy, as if the very fabric of time was shifting around him. He was being pulled back, pulled through the tunnel, back to his own world. But as he emerged from the tunnel, the weight of what he had done settled heavily upon him. He knew that the future he had seen was only one possibility, one path. He had prevented it, but there were countless other futures, each shaped by the choices he made. The tunnel closed behind him, vanishing as if it had never existed. Thomas stood in the forest once again, the eerie silence replaced by the familiar sounds of the world. But he would never forget the future he had seen, the future he had saved, or the truth behind the tunnel that had brought him there. And as he walked away, he couldn't help but wonder, had he truly averted the end, or had he merely delayed it? The future, after all, was never set in stone. Second story, The Forgotten Cycle. Lucas had always felt a strange pull toward the abandoned lighthouse on the cliff. Ever since he was a child, it haunted his dreams, always dark, with shadows that twisted unnaturally. The town he grew up in was small, isolated, and steeped in strange, whispered rumors. People spoke of the lighthouse as if it were alive, a gateway to something unknown. But Lucas, a skeptic by nature, never believed in these tales. He dismissed them as folklore, stories passed down from the old generations. Now, at 30, Lucas had returned to the town to settle his late father's estate. The house he inherited was just a short walk from the lighthouse, and the eerie feeling of the place gnawed at him daily. It was just an old building, nothing more. Yet something about it called to him. On a foggy evening, curiosity overcame him. He found himself standing at the base of the lighthouse, staring at the crumbling structure. It was a towering silhouette against the mist, its once proud light long extinguished. His breath came in shallow gasps as he approached the rusted door, half closed as though someone had been there recently. The door creaked open with little effort, and Lucas stepped inside. The interior was just as decayed as the exterior, dust-covered floors, broken windows, and walls that had been ravaged by time and neglect. But there was something off about it. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, yet it felt familiar. It was as though Lucas had been here before. As he ventured further up the spiral staircase, a strange sensation crawled up his spine. It wasn't the oppressive atmosphere of decay that unsettled him, it was the overwhelming feeling of déjà vu. Each step he took felt as though it was happening for the second time, like he had already walked this path 1,000 times. At the top, the view of the sea was obscured by thick clouds of fog. The light at the top of the lighthouse was gone, but in its place was an intricate mechanism, gears, dials, and strange symbols etched into the metal. It was as if someone had tried to repair it, but the work was unfinished. Lucas's mind raced as he studied the machine. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled, a low hum vibrating through his body. A door, hidden in the back of the room, opened by itself. A cold, inviting draft seemed to beckon him inside. Without thinking, Lucas stepped through the door and into a small, dimly lit room. At first, it seemed like just another storage area, but as his eyes adjusted, Lucas realized there was something far more unsettling. On the floor, in a perfect circle, were dozens of candles, their wicks extinguished long ago. In the center of the circle was an old journal, bound in what looked like weathered leather. The moment Lucas picked it up, a sharp pain pierced his head, and the room around him blurred. His vision warped, and for a split second, he saw flashes of a world that wasn't his, endless rows of lifeless bodies, clocks spinning backward, and shadows walking against the flow of time. The pain subsided, and Lucas found himself back in the room. The journal in his hand seemed heavier now, as if it contained the weight of centuries. When he opened it, the first page was dated exactly 30 years ago, the year of his birth. His breath caught in his throat as he read the cryptic words. The cycle begins again. The lighthouse calls, and the lost must return. Before he could read further, the lighthouse groaned, a deep, resonating sound that shook the entire structure. The room grew darker, and the air thickened with the scent of old earth. Lucas's heart pounded as he realized that something had changed. The lighthouse wasn't just a forgotten relic, it was a key, and he had unwittingly unlocked something far darker than he could have imagined. In the distance, The sky cracked open with streaks of lightning, but there was no thunder, only a low, unsettling hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. Lucas rushed to the door, but it slammed shut, trapping him inside. The walls around him pulsed with an unnatural energy, and for the first time in his life, Lucas truly felt afraid. Suddenly, the hum stopped. Everything went silent. A shadow appeared in the doorway, tall and thin, its form flickering like a broken light. The figure stepped forward, and Lucas froze, recognizing its face, his own. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a smile of recognition. It was a grin full of malice, a twisted reflection of his own despair. "You shouldn't have come here, Lucas," the figure whispered in a voice that sounded like his, yet distorted. "You never escape, not this time." As the figure advanced, the room around Lucas seemed to dissolve, replaced by flashes of familiar yet distorted scenes. His childhood home, his parents' faces, his own reflection, all flickering like a broken film reel. In each scene, he was alone, trapped in a repeating loop, a cycle that seemed to stretch on forever. He had seen these moments before, but they always ended the same. He was left behind, forgotten. The figure's voice echoed again, louder this time, reverberating inside his skull. "The cycle has always existed. You've always been here. You can't escape it." Panic surged through Lucas. He turned to run, but the lighthouse walls shifted, changing shape, closing in around him. No matter which way he turned, the same door, the same path, led him back to the beginning. The cycle was real. The lighthouse wasn't just a building, it was a prison, a point in time where reality broke, where lives became trapped in an endless loop. Lucas fell to his knees, clutching the journal as if it could save him. But the pages were no longer blank. They were filled with the same distorted memories, the same cycles of hopelessness, stretching out before him in endless repetition. And then, in the silence that followed, he understood. The lighthouse wasn't a place. It was a moment in time, a fracture that allowed people like him to slip through the cracks. Those who came here were not just travelers, they were pieces of a broken loop, caught in the fabric of a reality that had long since unraveled. The figure stood over him, watching silently, its grin widening. Lucas knew now. There was no escape. He had always been part of the cycle, and it would continue forever. As the figure whispered one final, haunting phrase, Lucas felt his mind slip away. "Welcome back." And the cycle began again. Third story, The Hollow Tree. It started with the tree, a gnarled ancient oak that stood alone in the middle of Black Hollow Forest, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal arms. The locals avoided it, muttering about curses and bad omens. But for Hannah, it was the perfect subject for her photography project. She had always been drawn to the eerie and the macabre, and the tree felt like it had been waiting for her. The air around it was unnaturally still when she arrived. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, rustling leaves, were absent. Instead, there was only silence, thick and oppressive. The tree's bark was blackened and cracked, as though it had been burned but never fully consumed. Its hollow trunk gaped open like a mouth, wide enough for a person to step inside. Hannah felt a strange pull, a compulsion to approach it. Her camera hung around her neck, forgotten for the moment. She ran her fingers over the bark, the texture rough and warm under her touch, as if the tree were alive. She stepped closer to the hollow. Inside, the darkness was absolute, swallowing the sunlight that should have penetrated it. A faint sound emerged from within, a soft, rhythmic hum, like the beating of a distant drum. Hannah leaned in, her curiosity outweighing her growing unease. "Help me," a voice whispered from the darkness. She stumbled back, her heart hammering. The voice was faint but unmistakable, tinged with desperation. Hannah told herself it was just her imagination, an echo of her own thoughts. But then it came again, louder this time. "Help me." Please." Before she could think, she grabbed her flashlight from her bag and shone it into the hollow. The beam illuminated only emptiness, the hollow far deeper than it should have been. The rhythmic hum grew louder, vibrating through her chest, and then she saw it, a face, pale and gaunt, staring back at her from the depths. Its eyes were sunken, its mouth moving soundlessly. Hannah froze, unable to look away as the figure reached out with a skeletal hand. The flashlight flickered and died. Darkness enveloped her, and the hum turned into a deafening roar. The world around her shifted, the forest spinning and warping until she was no longer standing on solid ground. When the dizziness subsided, she found herself in a different place entirely. The tree was still there, but it was no longer in the forest. It stood in the middle of an endless expanse of blackened earth, the sky above a swirling mass of grey clouds. The air was thick with ash, and the faint smell of burning lingered. "Hannah!" the voice called again, louder now and echoing from all directions. She turned, but there was no one there. The only movement came from the tree, its branches creaking as they twisted unnaturally. The hollow gaped wider, and a figure began to emerge. It was the face she had seen before, now attached to a thin, emaciated body that seemed barely able to stand. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, filled with an emotion she couldn't place, fear, hunger, or perhaps something darker. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped. "I didn't mean to," Hannah stammered, taking a step back. "What is this place?" The figure tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural. "This is where the hollow leads. You were called like the others." "Others?" The figure pointed behind her, and Hannah turned to see them, hundreds, maybe thousands of shapes standing motionless in the distance. They were human-like but wrong, their bodies elongated and twisted. They stood in perfect rows, their heads bowed, as if waiting for something. "Once you hear the call," the figure continued, "you belong to it. The tree takes, and it does not give back." Hannah's mind raced. She couldn't stay here. There had to be a way back. She turned to the tree, its hollow now pulsating like a heartbeat. The rhythmic hum returned, louder than ever, pulling her toward it. "How do I get out?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its gaunt face inches from hers. Its breath smelled of decay, and its eyes burned with a strange light. "You don't," it whispered. "You become part of the hollow." The figure reached out, its bony fingers brushing her arm. Cold seeped into her skin, spreading through her veins like ice. Hannah screamed and pulled away, but the tree's pull grew stronger. The ground beneath her feet cracked and crumbled, dragging her closer to the hollow. "No!" she shouted, clawing at the dirt to stop herself. The figures in the distance began to move, their heads rising in unison. They turned toward her, their empty eyes glowing faintly. One by one, they began to walk toward the tree, their movements slow but purposeful. Panic consumed her. She grabbed a branch and tried to pull herself up, but the tree seemed to resist her efforts, its bark tearing at her hands. The hum grew deafening, and the hollow yawned wider, ready to consume her. And then she remembered her camera. With trembling hands, she raised it and snapped a photo of the hollow. The flash lit up the darkness, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to shudder. The figures stopped, their heads tilting as if confused. She snapped another photo, and another. Each flash seemed to weaken the tree's pull, the hum faltering like a dying engine. The hollow began to shrink, the figures retreating into the shadows. Finally, with one last burst of light, the tree let go. Hannah collapsed onto the blackened ground, gasping for air. The tree was still there, but its hollow had sealed shut, and the hum was gone. The twisted figures had vanished, leaving her alone in the desolate landscape. She stood on shaky legs, her camera dangling from her neck. The tree no longer felt alive, but the weight of its presence lingered. As she turned to leave, a faint whisper reached her ears. "You can't escape the call." Hannah ran, not daring to look back. She didn't stop until the world shifted again, the forest reappearing around her. The tree stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened, but she knew better. The photos on her camera told a different story. Fourth story: The Lighthouse Keeper's Sin. The lighthouse stood alone on the edge of the cliff, its silhouette jagged against the stormy night sky. To the locals, it was a cursed place, whispered about in hushed tones over drinks at the pub. No one dared venture near it, not since the incident 30 years ago when the previous keeper vanished without a trace. But to Evelyn, the lighthouse was a mystery she needed to unravel. A historian by trade and an adventurer by heart, she was drawn to the stories surrounding the place. Her research had uncovered references to the forgotten cycle and strange accounts of missing people, all linked to the lighthouse. The deeper she delved, the more convinced she became that it wasn't just a myth. Evelyn arrived just as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon. Armed with her journal, flashlight, and an uneasy determination, she pushed open the rusted door. The air inside was heavy, carrying a metallic tang that stung her nostrils. Dust swirled in the dim beam of her flashlight, and the spiral staircase ahead seemed to stretch endlessly upward. As she climbed, the air grew colder. The walls were etched with faint carvings, symbols she couldn't decipher, but felt disturbingly familiar. Her breath caught when she reached the top room. The large mechanism that once powered the lighthouse's beam was still there, but it had been altered. Strange dials and gears that didn't belong in any historical records had been crudely affixed to it. In the center of the room lay a journal, its pages scattered across the floor as if someone had been rifling through them in a hurry. Evelyn knelt to pick it up. The handwriting was hurried and uneven, but the words sent chills down her spine. "To whoever finds this, do not touch the machine. It binds time. It binds us." I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. The lighthouse is alive. It doesn't keep ships safe. It traps them in a moment, just as it does us. Forgive me. I unleashed it. The journal was signed by Lucas, the missing keeper. Before Evelyn could process the gravity of the note, a low hum began to resonate through the room. The machine trembled as the dials turned on their own. The light at the top of the tower flared to life, sweeping across the ocean like a vengeful eye. Evelyn stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her grasp. The hum grew louder, and with it came the sound of whispers, soft at first, then rising into an overwhelming chorus. The voices surrounded her, too many to count, each speaking in a language that felt both ancient and incomprehensible. The room distorted, the walls seeming to ripple like water. And then, she was no longer alone. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, its face obscured by the dim light. Its presence felt wrong, as though it didn't belong in the same dimension as her. When it stepped closer, Evelyn gasped. The figure's face shifted constantly, as though cycling through dozens of people. But one face stood out, a reflection of her own, twisted with anguish. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said, its voice a blend of countless others. "The cycle holds us all. It will hold you too." Before she could respond, the floor beneath her gave way. Evelyn fell, but not into darkness. She landed in a field, the lighthouse now a distant speck on the horizon. The air was warm and heavy, filled with the scent of flowers that didn't belong to any species she recognized. Evelyn turned and froze. The field was littered with people, all standing motionless, their eyes glazed and unseeing. They were like statues, frozen in mid-step, their faces twisted in fear or confusion. As she approached one, she noticed their features were eerily familiar. It was her face, but older, worn and hollow. Her breath quickened as the whispers returned, louder now. The figures began to move, jerking unnaturally, as though strings pulled them. They all turned toward her, their eyes empty yet burning with intent. Evelyn ran. The ground beneath her shifted, turning into the cold, hard steps of the lighthouse staircase. She was back, but not as she had left it. The walls were alive, pulsating with an otherworldly energy. The mechanism in the room above hummed louder, the dials spinning faster. A voice echoed through the lighthouse, deep and resonant. The keeper must remain. The cycle cannot be broken. Evelyn realized the truth too late. The lighthouse didn't just trap time, it demanded a guardian, a prisoner to keep the machine running, to maintain the fractured timelines it controlled. Lucas hadn't disappeared. He had been consumed by the cycle, his existence erased and replaced. She tried to run, but the staircase twisted endlessly, leading her back to the top no matter how far she descended. The figure was there again, waiting, its face now fixed as her own. "You are the keeper now," it said, its voice merging with hers. The machine roared to life, the light sweeping across the ocean in a blinding arc. Evelyn screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the hum. The figure stepped closer, merging into her until she could no longer tell where it ended and she began. Her last thought before the darkness claimed her was that the whispers had changed. They were no longer incomprehensible. They were her own voice, echoing back to her. The lighthouse stood silent once more, waiting for the next traveler drawn to its call. The cycle continued, and Evelyn's name was added to the list of the forgotten. Fifth story: The Echoes of Absence. Lucas sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the faint red glow of the alarm clock. The numbers flickered slightly, as though the clock was unsure of the time. It was 3:33 a.m., a moment suspended in unnatural stillness. The house was silent, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He rubbed his temples, trying to dispel the unease. His nightmares had grown worse over the past few weeks, ever since his older brother, Caleb, vanished. The police labeled Caleb as a missing person, but Lucas knew that wasn't the full story. Caleb wasn't just gone, he had been erased. Photos of him had begun to fade, as if the ink itself were dissolving. His room remained untouched, but items that Lucas swore had been there, an old leather jacket, a set of keys, were simply gone. Even their mother, once inconsolable, now barely mentioned Caleb's name. It was as if the world was conspiring to forget him, but Lucas remembered. He couldn't forget the last conversation they'd had, standing in the middle of an abandoned rail yard on the edge of town. Caleb had been obsessed with a rumor about a tunnel that appeared only under certain conditions, when the moon was at its peak, and the air carried the scent of rain. The Tunnel of Silence, Caleb had called it. It's not just a myth, Caleb had insisted, his voice trembling with equal parts fear and fascination. It's a doorway, Lucas, a way to see what lies beyond our reality. But if you go through, you might not come back. Lucas had laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to another one of Caleb's wild theories. But now, as he sat in the suffocating quiet of his room, he wasn't so sure. That night, driven by a restless desperation, Lucas made his way to the rail yard. The sky was overcast, the moon barely visible behind a thick veil of clouds. The scent of rain hung heavy in the air, and a faint breeze carried the distant rumble of thunder. As he approached the spot Caleb had described, a shiver ran down his spine. The tunnel was there, just as Caleb had said. It loomed in the darkness, its entrance yawning wide and impossibly black. Lucas felt a strange pull, as though the air itself was drawing him closer. He hesitated at the threshold, his heart pounding. Caleb had warned him about the tunnel, but the need to know the truth was stronger than his fear. Clenching his fists, Lucas stepped inside. The air changed immediately. It was colder, heavier, pressing against his skin like a damp shroud. The walls of the tunnel were rough and uneven, carved from a stone that seemed to drink in the light from his flashlight. His footsteps echoed faintly, but the sound felt wrong, distorted, as though it were coming from somewhere else. As he moved deeper into the tunnel, Lucas began to notice strange markings on the walls. Symbols that looked like a language, but one he couldn't read. They seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. And then he heard it. A faint whisper, just beyond the edge of his perception. It wasn't words, but a sound that carried an unsettling familiarity. Lucas stopped, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Caleb?" he called out, his voice small and uncertain. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from further ahead. Swallowing his fear, Lucas pressed on, the sound guiding him. The tunnel began to change. The rough stone walls gave way to smooth, metallic surfaces. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of rain was replaced by something acrid and chemical. Lucas's flashlight flickered, but he didn't stop. He reached the end of the tunnel, stepping into a vast, empty expanse. The ground beneath him was smooth and reflective, like black glass, and the sky above was a swirling void of grey and white. The city stretched before him, silent, lifeless, and oppressive. Lucas recognized the place from Caleb's sketches. It was the future Caleb had spoken of, but seeing it with his own eyes was far worse than he had imagined. Buildings stood in perfect symmetry, their windows dark and soulless. The streets were devoid of life, not even a single blade of grass growing in the cracks. But the worst part was the silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence in itself, pressing against his ears, his chest, his very thoughts. "Caleb!" Lucas shouted, his voice swallowed by the void. A movement in the distance caught his eye. A figure stood at the far end of the street, motionless and shrouded in shadow. Lucas ran toward it, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. As he drew closer, the figure became clearer. It was Caleb, or at least, it looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't move, even as Lucas reached out to him. "Caleb, it's me!" "What happened to you?" Caleb's lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, Lucas felt the words in his mind, a deep, guttural voice that didn't belong to his brother. "You shouldn't have come." Lucas stumbled back, his breath hitching. Caleb, or whatever this thing was, began to shift. His features distorted, his body elongating and twisting in impossible ways. "The tunnel binds us," the voice said, echoing in Lucas's skull. "It takes what it wants, and now it wants you." The silence grew deafening, pressing into Lucas's ears like needles. The city around him began to warp, the buildings twisting and collapsing into the void. The figure that had been Caleb stepped closer, its shape dissolving into a black mist that surrounded Lucas, pulling him into the ground. He screamed, but no sound escaped. The world faded, and he was back in the tunnel, lying on the cold, damp floor. The symbols on the walls pulsed faintly, as if mocking him. When Lucas stumbled out into the rail yard, the tunnel was gone. The night was still, the air heavy with the scent of rain. But he wasn't alone. The whispers followed him, faint at first but growing louder with each passing day. The world around him began to change, photos faded, people forgot his name, and his own reflection in the mirror began to blur. Lucas realized too late that Caleb's warning hadn't been enough. The tunnel wasn't just a doorway, it was a trap, and now he was part of its endless cycle.